Okay, we are live. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On today's show, I have a very special guest. His name is Joshua Stylman. His last name is spelled Stylman. And if you're watching this on Rumble, X, or Rockfin, you'll see one of the articles on his excellent Substack. And I will put a link to his Substack. It's his last name.substack.com. And this is the Technocratic Blueprint. A very timely, he writes on very timely subjects. So go check these links and check out his articles. As people might know, Trump came in. This today is the 23rd of January, 2025. Trump is inaugurated on Monday, the 20th, and already has done something that overlaps and coincides with the research that Josh has done about this technocratic blueprint. And over there, Trump has announced a private sector $500 billion investment in AI infrastructure, a massive amount of money, really. And he rolled out this public announcement with some tech overlord bigwigs, SoftBank's Masayoshi Son, Sam Altman of OpenAI. There's some background story there. And Oracle Chairman Larry Ellison, one of the richest men in the world. So I think that some of these articles I will check out, and I'll pull this up. But this is the Technocratic Blueprint. But also he showed me some other stuff, part 1, 2, and 3 of Engineering Reality. I think it's very important for people to check this out. They don't really know the totality of how immersed we are in this massive propaganda engineering. He mentions the Truman Show in some of his articles. And I was reading through this. He also mentions Laurel Canyon, this kind of creation of culture. And I did a Laurel Canyon recently within the last couple of weeks. Laurel Canyon Revisited, based on the McGowan book with Julie of Cosmic Peach. And I was also pleasantly surprised to find out that he had produced, I didn't know this at the time, but he produced a documentary whose director I had on, Jennifer Sharp, and the documentary is called Anecdotals, and it was about quote vaccine unquote injuries. I will not call it's really not a vaccine, and it's really disgusting too, because before Trump came into office, Fauci gets this unprecedented blanket pardon for what crimes has he committed. But it's very telling about Fauci and this whole, and it ties in with Josh's kind of subject matters, but he can talk more about that. So Joshua Stylman, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm a big fan, as you all know.
Cool. Well, I'm a fan of your writing. I'm glad I read through all your Substack. I was trying to get into it as much as possible, with the time that I have, but this is stuff that's very important, and you have a great handle on so many of these characters, the more recent stuff that's happening in the world. Maybe you can talk about your background, your Substack, and then some of these more recent articles, and we can just go from there.
Sure. So I guess I'm a longtime entrepreneur. I was in the tech world for 20 plus years. About 10 years ago, maybe a little longer, I decided to start a brewery in my hometown of Brooklyn, New York. Kind of a midlife crisis project of sorts, but really fun project, really great company. Until pandemic, of course, which, like a lot of people, sort of put us on a different course. I will say I took COVID as seriously as anyone, certainly early on. I was duped, like a lot of us. And my alarm bell started ringing when I started hearing about vaccine mandates. And again, I'll call them vaccine mandates, but we are in agreement. It's an experimental gene therapy, but for nomenclature purposes, we'll call it vax mandates. I won't get into the whole story, but I had a very public cancellation where I spoke against the mandates because I resented having to check people's arbitrary biomedical status in our spaces in New York City. Surprisingly, the New York Times called for our little small business. I mean, we're kind of a cool New York City company, but not a nationally known brand. New York Times called, said, "Do you want to talk about this?" I said, "Of course, we should all be talking about this." I spent, 45 minutes on the phone with the reporter, explained that, I explained I started making comments on Twitter, and I gave what I thought was a very thoughtful, nuanced take about how we need to not other people in society. And, it echoes, Jim Crow and Maoism and early Nazi Germany. I was specific enough to say, of course, I'm not talking about 1943. I even explicitly said that, but, sure does sound like the health pass in 1933. I explained to her that my family members are all concentration camp survivors. I heard these stories my whole life. And I simply have a hard time checking people's biomedical status. Further, I was stupid enough to get the jab. I got the J&J. So 10 minutes later, there might as well have been a story I'll paraphrase, but it might as well have said, Three's Burning CEO is an anti-Semite anti-vaxxer, because I dared invoked the Nazis and I spoke against mandated medical procedures. So as you can imagine, my community in very inclusive New York City on virtually every other topic didn't take very well to that. My team, who sort of knew my character but didn't understand the issue, was like, you have to apologize. So I launched a Substack at that time, only to write in my words. It's the first post at the bottom, which essentially opened with, I stand by every one of my words. I didn't bend the knee. They really freaked out. So at the time, we had maybe like 600 wholesale customers. And within 24 hours, we had about half that. I wrote a follow-up Substack that basically said, I need to get the hell out of New York City. I got to get my kids out of here because, I could have rationalized it and said, I can go on a tour and show my customers I'm a good guy, or maybe I can have a point. That sounded terrible. Something clearly was going on, mass psychosis, whatever you want to call it. Before that, I had already started working with Jennifer Sharp on Anecdotals. So she is just such a force of nature and made such an important film that I do hope more people see, talking about her own journey and, as a vaccine injured person, and covered the lives of others. And it's a really, really important film that I was honored to help her out with. But I also knew that movie was going to come out, and I knew this would all happen again. And I had already been working as well with a bunch of friends, kind of started as some of my best friends, and we brought on like a couple of scientists and doctors and kind of a study group, for lack of a better word. And we started on the mRNA. It just is a bunch of concerned parents wondering what the hell we're going to do for our kids, who we knew didn't need to be injected with this. And then, it quickly got us to, central bank digital currency and financial crimes. And now we're like, our little group is, 4 or 5 years in. And I think it has reframed the entire way most of us look at the world in exploring topics, including the ones I started writing about, and others that are even more esoteric, including some of the topics you cover. So, it's been an interesting journey. It's been impossibly humbling as a middle-aged man to realize that I actually don't know anything. I just know what I was told. But I am open-minded enough to now try to reframe all the things I thought I knew in a different light. And I guess a few months ago, I'd written sporadically on Substack, throughout the last couple of years. But a few months ago, I decided to just take we have a mountain of notes. And I decided to just take some of the themes and start writing about them and start articulating them in my words. Because it got back to me, for example, there are a few old friends who stopped talking to me for various reasons, though have never confronted me, that have said things like, oh, Josh went crazy. And rather than those things and the ad hominems fly around it, I'd rather present my ideas in my words. If people are interested, they can read them. If not, then they won't, and that's fine. So sort of my long-winded intro, but yeah, I'm certainly interested in a lot of the themes that you cover, and some other. I think there are a handful of people on the internet, you being one of them, that just do extraordinary work on really complex issues that often get sort of trivialized or reduced into like conspiracy, but it's such a stupid, reductive term. And I look at people like you or Sam Tripoli or Courtney Turner or Jay Dyer, and there's just some extraordinary work being pushed out there that once you zoom out and sort of see how long these patterns have been emerging, they're undeniable. They're truly undeniable. And I think we all need to pay a little bit closer attention to them to try to interpret the world we're living in today. So not even just from a historical point of view, but to say, okay, well now so-and-so pops up as the new voice pushing us in a particular direction. What might that mean? And is there a chance we're being manipulated? Because if you go back in time, I'm pretty convinced that I've been manipulated about everything I thought. So.
Well, if it makes you feel any better, you're not alone. I think that there's a lot of people who've been atomized like myself who, like, I have a traditional education, like state school education, and I like literally reached like the so-called mountaintop and had to relearn so much stuff and recontextualize. They don't teach you a lot of that stuff, a lot of the background things that you cover, this
Yeah.
old agendas and a lot of these kind of secret groups, secretive groups that are guiding things, and they're important. These old kind of groups, like you talk about, Rhodes and some of these other groups, roundtable groups. They're and all these guys, H.G. Wells, leads up. The Huxleys are so important too. Like people saw glimmers of them, but they really believe all this stuff. And the like the new Harari's, the new Huxley, and this trust the science overlaps to Fauci, really, who had all of these things and whose background and ideology I think have not been looked into, but he is a bioweapons expert,
Yep.
guys. Like people don't know that he has this background, and gain of function is synonymous with bioweapons. So he's conducting gain of function research. It's just a nice euphemism. So we have to go back and learn about all this stuff, this population control and the population things, and you've done a great job in kind of going into that. And actually, I mean, all of your links are legit. Like I was looking through your links and it popped up The Next Million Years by Galton, Charles Galton Darwin. So like a lot of the stuff is really, accessible. So people need to read it. Yeah. So you've kind of like, you've really just kind of been on a writing flurry within the last 6 months, right?
Um, I've been privately writing, and with my little study group here, we've been writing for the last few years, and I'm finally transcribing that into something hopefully coherent for people, at least just to get started on. The phenomenon you're talking about, by the way, with the bioweapon stuff, actually goes back to the Nazis. Just as an aside, or at least to the Nazis, where they and Andy Jacobson's landmark book about Operation Paperclip talks about essentially it was the Rockefeller Foundation, it was the pharma companies, and they came up with this notion of the sword and shield. So they're going to create a weapon and then protection for the weapon. So you can read between the lines and see if that sounds familiar. But yeah, I guess to the point of documentation, again, you've certainly been one of my inspirations in terms of how to present this really weird material and seemingly outlandish material. And I think it's really important. I try to give editorial if appropriate or where appropriate. But if you just go back to the source material and see the words that they said, going back at least, in this case of the, whether it's the Technocratic blueprint essay or engineering reality, there was clearly a plan that was laid out, and it's on us to determine whether or not they've executed on it. Even things more recent and closer to home. About a year ago, I wrote something. It started in a private discussion, and I wrote it for the Brownstone Institute, called "The Anatomy of the Tech-Industrial Complex." And I sort of go through, and that was my field, so this one hit really close to home. I go through the genesis story of some of the tech superpowers, of things that I didn't know going back a couple of years, but stuff like Jeff Bezos's grandfather started DARPA, which ostensibly started the internet. And I've read a lot about Jeff Bezos through the years, and I think he's a really interesting guy. I found an essay that talked about the influence of his grandfather, but it talked about his sort of DIY spirit. It didn't say the guy literally started the internet. Google, which is my direct field, I was in the search engine category. Famously, their story was that they started in a garage, and it was a couple of Silicon Valley, people essentially knighted them and said they're the next big thing. Lost in the story was that the company was literally started by a CIA grant. And you keep going, and I'm sure some of this stuff. I don't know if your listeners do, but the day Facebook launched, so Facebook was originally it launched on, I think it was February 4th, 2004. That same day, the Department of Defense, or DARPA, shut down, the Pentagon shut down what they called their LifeLog project. So LifeLog, what their mission was going to be to track a person's entire existence in the digital sphere. They shut down. Facebook launches same day. So yeah, maybe that's just a really weird coincidence, but I'd probably think otherwise. I can keep going on. One more I'll mention.
No, but it's
Because
really
it's a
true.
fun one.
InQtel is all over Silicon Valley, and it's starting
Yep.
all this stuff. And they all have
Yep.
fictions. Musk has fictional kind of background story.
Yeah.
All these other guys, they're scrapping and all this. His dad owns like mining interests. And
Yeah. Well, Musk is a whole other thing. The one that I thought was really fun though was that the original MK Ultra mind control was Project Bluebird. And then I started thinking about Twitter's logo, the original Twitter logo. And you start connecting some of these dots, and maybe I'm a crazy person and I'm seeing patterns where they're not there, or maybe there's something there.
It's pretty disturbing, and it's all morphing and changing. Like you wrote in one of your articles that Meta's announced to populate Facebook feeds with AI generated content.
Yep.
So you're gonna be bored into this kind of AI environment, maybe not even know it. Like Meta, and I think Zuckerberg is very sinister actually, and he's tried to kind of rebrand himself in the context of like the new Trump administration, but these guys have very sinister backgrounds and fronts that people don't know. The LifeLog thing is very disturbing, and all that information data generation is off the charts. Yeah,
I want to take people at their word. If Mark Zuckerberg is really upset about the position his company took or their inaction on fighting government censorship, then he should donate some of his gigantic fortune into helping the vaccine injured, who were not presented with informed consent, in part because of the impossibly censorious nature of his giant empire.
And there's a really scary internal video that he said to his own employees, this is an untested product. So he's allowing the censorship to happen. People don't know the dangers. And he's telling his internal employees, probably a value to him, hey, watch out for this. I bet he didn't take it. He didn't take the shot. I mean, that's actually how I got started in my Bioweapon Blues episodes, which is 50 episodes long, was really watching the sudden and unexpected testimonies on Facebook that kept getting censored over and over again. So I was trying to keep kind of the memoriam of all these people telling the stories of their loved ones dropping dead and get injured that are all gone. So, Zuckerberg can burn in hell. We can get into his child rape stuff that's all over Facebook. He's got to know that things going on. He's been put in front of Congress for that. He had a mea culpa, cheap, superficial mea culpa. The guy's a monster. I'm sorry. It's a total joke. Meta's a joke. And the people are tolerant of all this evil crap. It's off the charts. Anyway, don't get me started.
I'm glad I did. And I can't say we disagree. I think the thing that people don't realize, just back to the AI component, is how fast this is moving and how transformative it is. And as someone who came up sort of in the 1.0 era of the internet, I remember just being a young man and just kind of talking shit to people I knew about this is going to transform the way we operate. But I was a kid and I didn't really know how the world operated anyway, quite frankly. But it certainly did. It changed everything. And it seems as if just the proliferation of artificial intelligence, or whatever you want to call it, is going to have that transformative effect on the world that we are going to pass down to our children and grandchildren. And it also, I don't know if you've been messing around with AI at all. And I initially was terrified of it and said, I'm not going to touch it. It's going to suck my soul. And, I sounded total like a Luddite. But then, I'm a parent and I want to understand the world my kids are going to grow up in. I want to understand how to help them navigate these tools. And I do love technology still. I understand that, it's a hammer and you can use it to build a house or bash someone in the head. It's just, what are you going to do with it and who's wielding it? But I decided to start playing around. But one of my best friends is a machine learning expert, and he's been all in just trying to play with these tools. And he's come to the conclusion that, he could do the work of 1,000 men if in fact he's prompting these machines right and understanding how to use them. So we've both sort of been taking this approach. And the one conclusion that I keep just coming back to is, oh my goodness, if I can get this for $20 a month, what the hell is the power structure using and how long has this been around? Because there is no possible, if you played with ChatGPT or some of these things, there's no way that this tech just showed up and is this remarkable already.
You have to think they had the resources to put all those kind of computers together and grind. I'm convinced that they had huge. I mean, they already do have it, Echelon and this kind of NSA type stuff, massive
Yep.
computer power to break kind of pretty good PGP privacy and things like that. I think they always had it. So
Seems like it.
yeah, I think.
Yeah, it's also we noticed, our little group noticed, I don't know, what, 2 years ago, that a lot of the Wikipedia entries seemed to be written by, they kept being rewritten because we were taking lots of screenshots of various things that when we saw how things were being censored, it was like a whack-a-mole, go away. So we'd take a screenshot. And we started following certain categories of pages, and the content that was showing up at a kind of rapid clip just seemed inhuman, for lack of a better word. Like, really, like if you go to like H.P. Lovecraft's Wikipedia page, it's longer than most American presidents. And you go to some others and you start seeing like very specific details. Like I had this whole thing about the Rhodes Scholarship, how I thought it was a MK Ultra mind control handler program, and started going through some of the Rhodes scholars. And it said stuff around like, he went to such and such high school, which opened at 11:11 a.m. on this day. Like really weird details that no one would ever know, let alone print. And then one has to wonder, is this a machine writing it? And or is it being presented in a way that may mean something to someone else out there in some sort of code? And I don't know, my mind starts racing with different ideas and interpretations of that, though. I think that's the key takeaway from me is I don't have any answers, but I sure do have a lot of questions, and nothing makes sense.
Right, but it's all about engineering reality, and these AIs are engineering reality. You had the whole Gemini, Google thing where they were programming super woke stuff like George Washington's black, and it was just ingrained in there. It wasn't conscious. It was just a reflection of all these other people working at Google and their information. And the Chat GPT, when I first started using it as a researcher and asking it questions, I was like, wow, this is amazing and knows so much. It was generating fake citations, like literal citations to academic papers that did not exist. So it was just literally self-generating. And I actually had to go and ask this guy, one guy was working at Rolling Stone. Did you write this paper? He's like, no, I've heard that Chat GPT is just making this stuff up. And I was like,
oh my,
he didn't write it. Yeah. So I was like, I mean, thank God the guy had the time, and I was like, thank you for your time. But that's what, and in the initial, I had to like throw all the earlier research I got from Chat GPT out as unreliable. So I mean, people have to really that's the dark side of this reality, is that the AI like literally could go back and rechange all of these old newspapers, like literally some kind of almost like re-engineering the past and the present, which I think is terrifying. Like that's how much power. It's like Skynet level power that people need to perceive and trust. I mean, I've used Grok for like some questions. It did a good job on getting me a recipe I couldn't find and certain things, but people need to be wary of this AI and how authentic they are, because I mean, people can just put in whatever they want. I mean, whatever their political bias, everybody has biases, so it can get integrated into AI. It's crazy.
Yeah, and my machine learning friend I mentioned gave a really good suggestion, which was ask it things that you know the answers to, and only ask it things you know the answers to, and then layer them together and triangulate to force it to conclusions, because you've said 1 + 1 is 2 and 2 + 2 is 4. Now feed it both of those equations and make it answer. And if you start layering those things in, it can't revert. So his mission is to beat these systems, and it's hilarious to watch. He sends me like 50 screenshots a day about it, and I worry that he's going to get swallowed by the Borg in the process, but that's a whole other conversation. But no, these tools are remarkable, and it does make you wonder. Again, you go back to like George Orwell or whatever, but like, if a group has enough power and enough control over sort of popular consensus, can you rewrite history? And has it been done already? For me, everything's back on the table. Because is the story of America true? The idea is magnificent. Do I know that it was real? Was there a Great Reset already? There's some evidence that there might have been, without getting into that whole can of worms. But like, I think that there are, I don't know, for me, there are things that I thought the book was closed on that I think it's important to reopen or at least reconsider.
Look at this rollout of this gene therapy, how powerful and potent it was. You mentioned Avril Haines flooding the zone with trusted sources. Their trusted sources, not the people that people trust. Nobody trusts the TV anymore. That's the consequence of a lot of this stuff. It's like with the rollout. But the power to enforce that reality under the Biden administration through censorship. Like if you take the overarching 30,000 feet view, what they pulled off in the Biden administration is unparalleled and super impressive that they could actually subvert almost all the kind of normal functioning of like the medical industry and the media at the same time and implement these. It's not even the shots. Like there was literal death protocols that I know people who died in the hospitals who were given remdesivir or run death is near, and like they're gone. These people are gone. Like they didn't want to even have any of these things happen to them. They're dead. They were murdered by this kind of phony, I would say negative incentive or perverse incentive structures to get people on respirators and all this stuff. But they were telling the public this is good and reinforcing it over and over again when it was obviously the opposite. So, and also the ability to actually facilitate and maintain this idea that there was this massive pandemic, that people were dying in the streets and all this was really effective. Like it was a great propaganda. And you said, like, I think you mentioned even H.G. Wells, like the propaganda is the key for the future, right? Or man, where's that quote that you had? It's incredible. The world brain, but I think it was like there was a quote that you had that I can't remember, but it was basically subject which will be just Russell. The subject of which will be of most importance politically is mass psychology. So you're seeing these kind of older guys who wrote this stuff, and then the implementation of all the stuff through Fauci, Harari, Fink, who's like been questioned recently. Like all these guys are implementing these old kind of New World Order philosophers. Would you agree with that?
100%. And I guess that's the part that I think like the most people had a blind spot on. Like I was aware of propaganda as an instrument, and I studied it. And I started a search engine marketing company in part because I loathed advertising, right? And I was like, oh, people get hit over the head with messages a million times a day that they're not interested in. Well, this is this really elegant solution. But putting aside the fact that I didn't realize naively that I was feeding the surveillance beast. But if I took them at their word, to me, that was like a, defection of advertising. I was also impossibly naive not to realize that Google eventually swallowed the whole advertising category. But the part that I didn't realize that was totally lost on me was how ingrained all of the mass psychological experiments are, or the historical framework for them, going back to like at least Freud, right? So I didn't understand. I had heard of MK Ultra, but I didn't really understand that there was this whole history of mind control. And if you fast forward now, and just watch, I know we all have the stories of our friends and neighbors that are really cool, really earnest people, but just completely wrong about everything they think may be right. And I went for like 3 years not yelling, actually calmly talking to these people, but trying to scream from the rooftops broadly, and watching people I knew that I thought I could present real evidence to and be persuasive with, and not get caught in, the dialectical games. And just immediately they would start labeling me as something that I'm not, like I'm just on the wrong team. And you watch these things happen over and over again. It's like, oh my God, you're not even speaking in terms of logic or rational thought. You're simply playing a tribal game. And by the way, I turned on CNN last night, so I heard that same line, and you're just a mimic, right? And we've heard it 1,000 times, whether it's the threat to democracy or, there's a great guy. He goes by Orf. I don't know if you've seen his work. He does these mashups of just like the Mockingbird media stuff, where like he does like 8 minutes of nobody's safe unless we're all safe, and it's literally just a montage of like MSNBC, CNN, and all the other talking head clips where they repeat the same speaking words. So Joe Biden, sharp as a tack, right? And it's that you go through these things and you watch them, if you hear it once, you're like, oh, okay, someone said a thing, but then you hear the same language, and like if you come out of that, even just watch like one of these few minute clips, and you see one of them and don't understand that this is part of a mass manipulation game, then you have lost the ability to think. And it kind of makes sense, right? We outsource everything else as a culture. We outsource our transportation and our food. Why wouldn't we outsource thinking? Just, hey, doctor, tell me what to do. Give me a needle. Give me a pill. And that's kind of where we're at.
We're there. We've already been boiled. The frog's been boiled in a lot of ways. Those interesting mashups are something else. Have you seen the Sinclair Media mashup where everybody, yeah, just like
I have.
it's like channel after channel repeating the same thing. It's incredible. Yeah. And so people don't see that broad thing. They just see their specific things. I don't know anybody who has the capacity of critical thinking who watches TV for information anymore. They just don't do it. They either are on Substack or Twitter or just something else. But like, it's as sinister as V for Vendetta, in my opinion.
Yeah, I linked to that Sinclair thing. I think it was in Reading Between the Lines, which was just a piece I wrote about pattern recognition. Because again, once you see these patterns, they become completely and utterly undeniable. And again, the bigger questions for me now is not, okay, I know they're lying. It's why are they lying? And what else would they lie about? And on the first thing, I have a lot of theories, but no real conclusions. On the second part, I think the answer is, well, it seems like they're going to lie about just about everything. So, and that's not to say, okay, someone in an institution or a mainstream publication tells you to do something, it's the opposite. But that's probably a better bet than them telling the truth, generally.
Right, but didn't you write in one of your articles, like the lie has a deeper meaning? It's not just that they're lying, it's that they just want to beat you down and make you accept the lie. Like there's something even more profound, and that's a communist trait.
Yeah, it is. And I wrote about that recently. It was in a piece called The Second Matrix, where I cited a guy by the name of Theodore Dalrymple, which I think is a pseudonym. But yeah, I mean, it's an old communist trick. And the point, there's also a thing I didn't include in the essay. I came across some research that I think it's the Turkics, not the Turks, but the Turkics. I'll find it and share it with you privately if you're interested. But the whole point is it's about humiliation. It's about our humiliation. And yes, they know they could do whatever they want, and they, of course, being the power structure. And now they're going to rub it in our faces. And I think we're watching what has been a very long, very sad demoralization campaign. And again, I'm certainly not above it. I took the bait in a lot of instances, and a lot of ways I've apologized to friends of mine. I called my sister, who lives in Florida, who I for years told her she's crazy, she needs to move, Florida's going to be underwater. And I've recently called her and said, hey, I was the dupe on that one. I never actually bothered to look into it. And more recently, I've become friends with a couple of climate scientists who have told me we are in no peril, and all we're doing is ushering in global communism. But they also know if they say that publicly, then they don't get tenure at their university and they don't get grant money for new projects. So
it's much like the medical environment, right?
It's the same idea. Yep.
Yeah, same idea.
My daughter thinks with the TM at the end.
Yeah, my daughter thought like that the world's going to end in 10 years and we're going to be underwater. But I've been around long enough to see Al Gore just lying for decades. So, like, I know what a cheap con man he is. Yep. But these young kids, they've really raped their minds. They really don't see the context. Like, they don't know, like, an Inconvenient Truth said that, Antarctica will be like a desert in 5 years. Well, it didn't happen.
Right.
And so they just keep changing their con. Yeah, it's bad.
Well, I think that's the funny part, William, is when they put timestamps on stuff. And then the time comes and goes. And then they point to like, oh, well, California's on fire. See, climate change is real. And one has to zoom out, and we can or cannot talk about LA, but like one has to zoom out and say, okay, well, it's really cold where I am in New York today. Does that mean climate change is not real? I mean, these are not conclusive things. These are minor points on a much bigger map. And again, for me, I think as a species, there's we're mimics. We tend to follow things. Like I could have taught my children anything, right? I could have taught them, you walk in a room, there's a couch there, that's where you put your shoes and you lay on the floor. And they'd have followed that custom if they followed their parents teaching them that from the time they were born. So it does beg the question of how much of this behavior that we see now and how much of the compliance is just entirely architected. I wrote a two-part thing a few months ago. One was called one was called The Illusion of Expertise, which was basically just a knock at basically all my friends in the entire laptop class. And the follow-up was called The Information Factory, which is just basically how truth is manufactured. And if you get into and I know you've covered some of this stuff, like you get into the history of compulsory schooling in the United States. Yeah. Well, it started because, the Prussian soldiers threw down their weapons to Napoleon, and the Prussian king was like, I want more compliant soldiers. I'm going to set up a better school system. And then Horace Mann was like, we need factory workers in the United States. Let's import that school system. So it does beg the question of, you put your kids in school, they're taught a lot of facts. They're not really taught about how to think about those facts. And ultimately what happens is you come out the other side and there's a series of, sort of quote facts or consensus facts that are preposterous to anyone who actually has domain expertise in any of those areas. And we're watching it manifest now into public policy, or maybe the DEI era is over now because we've got a new administration, but I don't know. It's fascinating to watch, and my observation is particularly among my smart friends. No one wants to, smart in air quotes, by the way. No one wants to engage in the substance of any of these conversations, right? If you dare suggest that there may be risks to vaccines, you're a danger to public health. If you dare question the integrity of our sacred elections, you're a threat to democracy. If you question the wars, how dare you? That's
Putin sympathizer, right?
All of them, and all the tropes just come out, and it's at some point, when do you start to accept that the world is not what we think, and the people manipulating us are complete psychopaths?
Yeah, I think Lenin said it best. Like, these are crazy people manufacturing things for crazy ends. It's like that. They're making money. I think it all comes down to cash, Rockefeller. And I think what's really scary about this kind of like factory process of education is that when you're out the other end, you're really a manufactured item. That's what's really like a hard, throwing some cold water on your face is realizing, holy smokes, I was not really learning. They created this, and it goes into engineering consciousness and engineering personality. Like in America, you could get 50 years old. You wonder how much of this stuff has been socially engineered for me, whether it's becoming this kind of like you wrote this great article about, like, you become a spectator class. Like, that's really it. Like, people just take it for granted. You're a spectator class. Just like Joe Rogan's show. It's all a bunch of spectators watching MMA. How much of that is manufactured? How much of your ideas are manufactured? How much of your passivity is manufactured? It's incredible when you really think about it. Like, whoa. And I think that there was a comedian, I can't remember his name, but he's like, what if MK Ultra was really just like traumatizing people over and over so you can control the whole society? And they're like, I think he just had a flash of insight. Like, that's really what it's all about.
Yeah. So two things, just to react to what you just said. So first, on the the spectator class or anything I'm writing about, I'm also realizing that it's just a projection for me. I'm certainly not above any of it. I almost feel like I am writing as a victim who broke my programming, right? Because we're all victims in this. I don't play that question. Like, we're all victims of this in some way. Somehow I feel like I broke my programming, and I can see it, and I just want to share it. And I would love constructive feedback from whoever's interested on whatever idea to say, hey, you might be right about this, or you're an absolute lunatic for that, and let's talk about the merits of the idea. On the part about money, I was there for a long time, and my view has evolved a little bit, to the extent that Of course, the rich and powerful people want to become richer and more powerful. Of course, I agree with that. That's sort of indisputable. But if you think about just the whole notion of the roots of the money, right, in the the modern debt slavery model, or the Federal Reserve or whatever it is, right? Not only do they own the printing press. So that means they not only have the money and the ability to make more money, they define the unit of measure. So they actually define what is value and what is valuable to other people. So when you start looking at some of the things that I covered in, like the engineering reality around culture, or if you take a look back and look at the history of technocracy, or you look at the modern day tech oligarchs, it does seem like something bigger is happening beyond just economic wealth. That there does seem to be this new world order, for lack of a better descriptor, or using their words, that they are shifting in this sort of new layer of reality for all of us to partake in. And I know you've covered extensively a lot of the occult stuff, and I know we're not going to go much longer, so we don't have to get into a lot of detail on that. But it does seem like, if you go back to the writings from 100 years ago, and then 80 and 60 and 40 and 20 and now, there are certain themes that pop up around NWO, or the Aeon of Horus, or Age of Aquarius, whatever you want to call it. And it does seem like something in humanity is shifting. And maybe it's a post-human world, maybe it's a reorganization of the existing human world. I was very glad to see that you had Mike Williams on your show. He's been huge in my journey as someone who paid
Sage of Quay, right?
Sage of Quay, yes. I think I DM'd you requesting you talk to him at some point, so I was glad you guys connected. Because that, for me, that was a huge on-ramp for a lot of the stuff, was just understanding the story of the Beatles, and that it was not what I thought it was. And again, that goes back to, like, oh, well, if they could pull this off, what else could they do?
Right, me either. Like, the Beatles is a hard one to get over. Like, you want to believe these four guys were geniuses and wrote some of the most important music ever, or the most listened to music. And then you go through what Mike Williams found. It's like, no way. There's no way they wrote Revolver. And if I was actually looking at one of the albums, it didn't even have the four members of the Beatles on it. It said arranged and credited by George Martin. I'm like,
right.
And then you find out all these other famous musicians are the session guys playing their music, like Jimmy Page.
Right.
It's incredible.
That whole, Yeah, it's funny. I found Mike's work because a friend of mine gave me the memoirs of Billy Shears, which just, I got like 100 pages, which is, for anyone who hasn't heard of it, it's written by the guy who claims to be playing Paul McCartney since the original Paul died, and was arguably ritually sacrificed on September 11th, 1966. So sounds totally batshit crazy, until you keep going in the book, and it's like, there's so much insidery information. There's so much detail in this. They use lyrics, which would be totally illegal on copyright law. The audiobook, which I also listened to, is read by George Martin's son. So clearly the band is aware of it, or whoever is responsible for the band nowadays is aware of it. And it's who put all the effort into this weird, hokey book that almost no one has read. And I was just looking for any information I can find on it. And I quickly found Mike. And again, then if you go with the logic of what else would they lie about, you keep pushing on it. And eventually, I think I might have found your podcast through your magnificent series with Hans Utter, where he talks a lot about the Grateful Dead. And you keep going on this stuff. And it's like, oh, actually, of course, it's all an op. My sense now is, if I've heard their name, then there's probably some manipulation happening here. That's not to say to be mistrusting of everyone. And I actually believe a lot of people involved in the manipulation may not even be aware of it. That people can be unwitting.
They don't see the big picture. I'm sure the Beatles guys at their young age, early 20s, they didn't understand what they were part of. I don't think so. I think Lennon eventually rebelled against it, but I think that they didn't see the big picture.
Yeah, I think you may be right. Although then there's another school of thought that a lot of people are born into this life, and people may not even look. If we don't have freedom of consciousness, and in a world of like mind control and manipulation, are we all consenting humans in anything?
Right. Correct. No, it's really amazing. Like, and you do the Laurel Canyon. All these guys are spooks, man. Zappa,
Yep.
Wilson, Crosby. I had a really weird, like a kind of like something that sticks with me is I ran into Crosby at a really high end hotel, and I thought of him as this kind of folk singer, really nice. And he was drinking and acting like a trucker, like real swearing and
Yeah.
saying really vulgar things about women, like that you could hear. And I'm like, wow. And I was young, I was a teenager at the time, and I was like, this really rewired my brain. Like, I thought that this guy was like a
Yeah.
folk hero, but he's acting like this. I was like, he has a totally different public persona. So he must put it on to go out and perform like, hey, I'm Dave Crosby, I'm just a folk playing guy. But yeah, no, it wasn't not in his personal, not in my experience, in his personal behavior. Wow, something else.
Yeah. He's a gun nut too, or was a gun nut, as I understand it. No, there, and again, Crosby's a great example, and Dave McGowan covered this in detail. That he was a Van Rensselaer and a Van Cortlandt. He's essentially American royalty, if such a thing
Yeah,
exists.
that's the pre-English, right? So they're the original Dutch settlers of Manhattan and New York. Wow. Yeah.
Yeah, and the lineage goes straight up to lots of preeminent people. I thought he was just a dirty hippie that sang like an angel, and as it turns out, there may have been something more going on there.
We are at the 45-minute mark. I fortunately have a hard stop. I probably could talk to you for hours, but Joshua, maybe you could just summarize things, where people can find your work and what you're working on right now, and where can they reach out and contact you.
Yeah, it's still funny though. I'll say, just to call it my work, because I'm just some dude who's like sitting in my cabin trying to connect dots in the world that may or may not exist. But I have been writing, as you said, at Stylman, stylman.substack.com. I'm on Twitter, jstylman, and I still call it Twitter, jstylman. I do stories on Instagram all the time, which is in part because that's where a lot of my old and some ex-friends are hanging out at. And that's just my last name in Instagram. And yeah, I mean, I'm focused on, I guess I'm in a bunch of different sort of activist groups. I was involved in a group that seemingly successfully tried to pull the United States out of the World Health Organization. I've been involved in some medical freedom work, including helping Jennifer with Anecdotals. But mostly I've just been doing a lot of deep research. Of late, I've been, and I haven't published on this yet, but I've been obsessed with the Internet of Bodies and the next generation of connectedness, so 6G, which I think is just more of the biodigital convergence stuff. I've been exploring kind of recent architecture and tech, and I'm becoming increasingly convinced there was a great reset 150 years ago, and a lot of other wacky stuff. So, at this point, I think I've made a conscious decision to stop trying to persuade people who aren't interested. And there's just a massive chasm, I think, in consciousness and awareness. And if I'm surrounded by sheep, I would rather try to just connect with the other lions and at least compare notes.
Yeah, great work, great research, very accessible, and you can see all the links and all that stuff. So I'll put a link to the Substack. But you actually have one of your articles, you actually have actions you can take. So it's not all dread and debility. It's implement strong privacy practice, support local networks, support decentralized technologies. So there's other things there that people can take these changes. I've talked to Gabriel Custodia too, somebody who's also very much into privacy and alternate technology. So once people start using these alternate technologies, they become more commonly available and typically cheaper too. So you can move with your feet. You don't have to just sit passively and become a spectator to all this.
That's right. And for the record, I am not black pilled. I just won't be in denial about the world we live in, but I'm I'm an entrepreneur. I have to be an optimist. So I am incredibly hopeful, and I am hopeful that more people start waking up and finding each other and take local action, because I think that is the opposite of globalism.
Yeah, and I think that actually the consequence of all of this stuff, AI, is going to be a flip back to an authentic way of lifestyle that people used to live maybe 200 years ago, which is probably one of the best things for humanity, where you could actually just unplug yourself from so many of these things and actually spend time with family and read at your own pace and grow your own food. So hopefully that's the change that people will take to get out of this human factory farm. Really, I mean, it's really that kind of gets that dark. Anyway, it's Joshua Stylman, S-T-Y. Let's see, Stylman, and the Substack is stylman.substack.com. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you so much. Really, really appreciate it. Thanks for everything you do.
Yeah, likewise. Stay there.